Rick Anderson is the fire ecologist and the descendant of a Kissimmee River Valley's earliest pioneers. For over 3 decades, he has served as a fire manager in 8 national park areas across the United States, including Everglades National Park. Currently, Rick works as an international fire management consultant and projects in Mexico, Belize, and the Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. He resides at Palmetto Island Ranch in Venus, Florida. With that, welcome, Rick.
Thank you, David. Well, the first thing I'd like to do is thank all the practitioners that have came before us, that paved this road that we're on to get fire in the landscapes that we care about. Especially, one of the things I want to acknowledge is all the OGs in the room that helped start this Prescribed Fire Council. I see Rosie. It's so good to see you. And to acknowledge all of the heavy lifting that's been done to get us where we were. I imagine if you have discussions for these folks with these folks who've been around a long time, there was some heavy lifting done in the very early days of this, not only to form the Prescribed Fire Council, but to get fire going in the state. We're very fortunate here in Florida that we're a so-called right to burn state. We can do this. Also, I want to acknowledge a very powerful tool that we have, and that's the Southern Fire Exchange. We have a Southern Fire Exchange here. It's a great clearinghouse and knowledge base for information, because one of the things I can tell you about all the years I've been in this business, it's dynamic, it's changed. It is not only the planet that I came up in, but it's not the Florida, the culture, the society, and everything else that we have going on here. I started my fire career actually on family lands, and then through what it really was, my dad knew that I was not really cut out for the farm. So I was able to find a place, well, he did for me, called Florida Division of Forestry, now the Florida Forest Service. Because one of the things that I was pretty good at was playing with fire. But it was when I was able to become a professional with the Florida Forest Service, I got good training. I started realizing a much greater fire world. And I want to tell you, after many decades in this business, essentially my lifetime involved in moving fire around the landscape, Florida practitioners and what we can learn in Florida and what we can do in Florida is up here, because I teach all over the United States. I teach all over the Western Hemisphere and occasionally in Europe. And I will tell you that we've got something good going on here. We're very fortunate. We're very fortunate to have the land management agencies that we have here as well. And again, I started out probably at one of the lowest rungs but it's a powerful place as a forest ranger with Florida Forest Service, because the decisions y'all are making, whether it's where you put your drip torch or whether you put out a fire at what acre, at what fire line you put in, you're making very powerful decisions. And I would submit that most of y'all on the ground making decisions at an initial attack or a prescribed fire are doing more powerful ecological work than maybe Tallahassee is, because you're doing it every day. This particular talk that I've got going on here is Humans, Fire, and Ecosystem Management. And it really is derived from not only a lifetime worth of work, but also projects that I've had with this international work has really helped me dial in a completely different way of looking things. For example, I just came out of some of the projects I had last year. Do you remember the fires in Maui? They're tragic, killed people. One of the things I was able to work as a subject matter expert for the Attorney General of Hawaii. And during the lawsuits, it was in the $1 billion range because of what was lost. And one of the things I want to impart to you, the weak spots that really put the onus on the state of Hawaii is they had plans to do fuel management and fuel mitigation and prescribed burning, but they didn't do them. They knew they had a risk. And when they got that particular day when everything aligned, power line goes down, and it's hard to think of Hawaii as a flammable place, isn't it? It's a grassland on Maui. So you can imagine the rates of spread. The other things that I've been involved in is part of this incident research management team. And there's an enormous amount of research going on in this country. And I saw some folks from NASA, I believe, in the back of the room, at least wearing NASA t-shirts. Other agencies are getting involved in fire research and fire science. And if any of you have been through a graduate program where you needed a prescribed fire space to do some kind of experiment or to collect data, it's pretty hard. And one of the things we do with this integrated research management team, we go to large landscapes, particularly DoD lands. And in this case, Merritt Island will be going pretty soon to Canaveral, to the Kennedy Space Area. We get a whole multidisciplinary group of scientists from all over. And we wire these large-scale prescribed burns from the soil all the way to 35,000, 40,000 feet in the atmosphere. And that's where we often use the NASA reconnaissance plane because we're picking up smoke, particulates, we're doing, and John, you know, fire behavior's got some weak spots in it. We're still using the old Rothermel spread model. But we have physicists now who look at fluid dynamics. So all of that is to say that pretty soon that with some of this data we're producing, just like so much we've got going on in our world, we can use an app. And I don't know if you know this, but many of your iPhones already have LiDAR on it, which will be able to pick up signals for fire behavior, heat sensing, and those kind of things. But to get to this presentation, what I want to share with you, and it's something important that you're part of a legacy for. Fire is a captured ecological process that we as Homo sapiens have captured. The ground that you're lighting has been lit before, and most likely by a human. We just saw the lightning presentation, and there was something I thought was a tiny bit misleading. Someone said that most of our fires in Florida were caused by lightning. And we saw the 500, you were pushing about 400 lightning detected fires in Florida, but Mr. Sadler told me that we have to actually had an excess of 5,000, around 5,000 human caused fires last year. So humans are an agent of fire. And we'll get to that point throughout this talk. But one of the things I want to make sure that is that we continue this long legacy of fire use on the planet and the peninsula. And much of my work in other countries is to continue, especially using traditional knowledge from indigenous people, to ensure that fire is continuing to be used for both community safety, economics, forest health, biodiversity, and cultural practices. And we'll talk about a little bit about that today. Anybody know where this scene is from? It could be. Why are you popping off with Myakka River, John?
Because it's a dry prairie like that?
It is a dry prairie. This happens to be Kissimmee Prairie State Park. One of the biggest fuel beds we have in Central Florida. But also I want to point out to you, and we learned this today already, that only a tiny percentage of lightning has the power to start fire. For example, when I was at Everglades, and we'll get to a slide later, we have many, that's another large fuel bed at about 1.2 million acres of fuel down there ready to go. But one of the things I want you to observe, because I know as land managers, biologists, and fire people, you can take a good look at this landscape. Is that a landscape receptive right now to ignition? And if you need a tip on how to think about this, if you look at the back of the Prescribed Fire Council, Central Florida Prescribed Fire Council t-shirts, they got that triangle on the back. Is this a receptive moment for lightning to start a fire? Why not? So you need heat, oxygen and fuel. That's one of the more fundamental, but you need weather, topography, and also ignition source. We often like to say, and this is good old American exceptionalism, that Florida is the lightning capital of the world. Is it? Do you know where it is? I do. It's the Congo in Africa. It gets pounded. We're not even in the ballpark. How many fires do you think they get over there? Not many, for a couple of reasons. One, broadleaf tropical forest, not very flammable, the fuels matrix, or they've altered the fuels matrix to where it's essentially bare ground or agricultural overgrazed. I also want to draw out this, and this is something I've been an advocate for prescribed fire for a very long time, like many of you. And I also served on an incident management team for many years, handling some of the most complex fires in North America. And this is the thank you firefighter sign has become ubiquitous. And John, I know you've seen this as you go in and out of fire camp and stuff like that. Contrast that to the scene on the right. And some of you might recognize this photo. It's from Palm Coast, a particularly woolly piece of palmetto with a patch and pine with incredible urban interface. Some of the most complex fire environments I encounter are not necessarily in California. They're in Florida. And one of the things that I'm so proud, if I can be, for what y'all are doing is y'all are burning the tough acres. I'm not going to say the Western firefighter myth is an easy thing to deal with, but I will say that what y'all do, there's a reason why we don't have complexity management teams too often in Florida. But y'all are doing the job. And as a fire practitioner, I definitely want to thank you for that. What you're doing is not easy. It's not as easy as it was when, again, John and Mr. Sadler and some of us were coming up. The complexities y'all face now are off the charts compared to what we started with. So thank you. Well, let's talk about humans in fire. This is my a good friend, Leticia, down in Clacmu, Mexico. And if you'll take a quick look at this text on the screen, and the reason why I wanted to feature her here, because these are the real fire scientists, the people who can take, and they're still cooking with fuel wood down there. They can take flame, heat, residency time, combustion, all those elements, and turn it into a delicious meal. And also, as Homo sapiens, we've been cooking the planet. Most of our emissions on this planet now come from savanna fires in Africa, Asia, Australia, and then the big blowups in the Western United States and Canada. In other words, anywhere where cellulose exists and it gets dry enough to burn. In other words, we have literally and have been cooking this planet for a very long time. And I want to draw attention to this. And for most of y'all, I think you have maybe a little special skills about reading the landscape. This is an ecosystem that you're probably not familiar with. This is one of the largest intact forests in the Western Hemisphere, called the Selva Maya. Southern Mexico into Belize and Guatemala. Humans have lived there for around 13 or 14,000 years. It's considered one of the most biodiverse places in the Americas. Does anyone see any evidence of fire on this landscape? But look at the shape and arrangement of those dead tree patterns. It's fairly patchy. This landscape gets burnt regularly. through the so-called, it's an environmental, the environmentalists have this prerogative statement they call slash and burn agriculture. For 13 or 14,000 years, this intact landscape full of biodiversity, jaguar, howler monkeys, spider monkeys, everything you would expect in a Mesoamerican tropical forest is existing here, along with one very important species, Homo sapiens. Abigail is standing next to me here. His community, when they made this a biosphere reserve, which is kind of like a national park on steroids. In other words, protection levels are almost wilderness level. The Mexican government moved his family out and his community out. You can't be here, even though they've been there for 13,000 years. You can't have these practices. So, of course, they move next door. And what they do is they still go around the landscape because with their traditional practices. For example, what you see us standing in front of in this particular photograph is what's called a milpa, which is one of the small slash and burn sites. It's only 2 acres. But he's got about 11 species of edible plants growing on this 2-acre patch. That 2-acre patch will last a season or 2. And then they'll go to another patch. That is why you're seeing that signature right there on the landscape with the dead trees as they move from patch to patch to patch. He feeds his entire community. They have honey, bees. They produce that for income. And again, they've been doing this for generations. The biodiversity is still there with humans on the landscape. He's now, because they've expanded the park boundary, his village has had to move 3 different times. But this is what just recently happened. Finally, the government said, you know what? Do your thing. It became clear, we collected enough data, it became clear that they weren't really doing much ecological damage. But often multinational non-government organizations, NGO, World Wildlife Fund, and others, I won't name them all. If you look at a climate change poster, what are you going to see? For sure, fire. Fire's been vilified and demonized. And it's also become a poster child for climate change. And we have this slogan that we like in Florida, good fire and bad fire. But I often ask the question, how do you know? And we'll talk about some of those details later. I want you to actually apprehend and take a good read of this slide too. And I'll hit some of the high points on it. And one of the things that we often forget is the sophistication of the indigenous people that we encountered. Now, I will acknowledge that we're not going back to 1491 ever again. So when we think about restoration ecology or moved to some primitive world, rewilding or whatever phrase you want to use, this might be difficult to achieve. Native Americans, and this is what I see in my work all over the world, Homo sapiens alter the landscape with fire. Whether it's good or bad, we'll talk about this in this more specific detail later. It depends on your objectives. I was glad to see Australia mentioned earlier today in some of the lightning work. And one of the things that, because I was in Australia maybe a year ago, last year, in March, and because I'm part of this International Savannah Fire Initiative, which one of the things that we're doing is prescribed burning in transition seasons puts enough carbon on the ground to sequestering carbon to abate climate change. Hot, dry season fires volatilize, like what you saw in the West and many other places. They volatilize because the efficient combustion puts a lot of stuff into the air. But transition season burning, low intensity fires, puts it back down on the ground. That's why Abigail and his crew is burning They don't have the money for artificial fertilizers. The fertilizers come from the nitrogen, what some people call biochar. And one of the things I've done in this presentation, I make a lot of claims, and probably some of it's going to be contrary to maybe what you believe or what you've been told. And so what I've done is I've aggregated all the research publications, particularly from archaeologists, anthropologists, and people who study the human relationship with fire. And that's what you're seeing right here when people have shaped this title here, People Have Shaped. This is from a journal article. And one of the most surprising things that we've seen is areas under Indigenous fire management are recognized as some of the most diverse areas remaining on the planet. And intellectually, you might want to think, why? And you could almost substitute Indigenous fire management with prescribed fire practitioners. Here's a great little paper by Cynthia Fowler, who is, she wrote one of the most amazing PhD dissertations in Timor, an island in the down in the Asian side of the planet. And it's called Ignition Stories. And what her research showed in Timor, she brought back to the United States and started looking at human use of fire here. And we actually have some pretty good data starting to see where charcoal, we can tell broadcast charcoal now, and it's very different than the sites that we have where people are just simply cooking. In other words, people have been moving fire around the landscape for many, many eons. But also you see that top sentence, and we'll get back to another study later in this talk. Discerning human from lightning-ignited fires is challenging, especially when you're looking at historical evidence. And anybody here from Jonathan Dickinson State Park? Has anybody been there? Well, they've recently published in 2023 a new version, a new edited version of his journal. And this is one of the first things I picked up out of this journal, is when he first arrived, they were shipwrecked, for you that don't know the story. It was a bunch of English folks. They were headed up to the English colonies in the northeastern United States. Spain controlled Florida at that time. It was when first contact was starting to occur with the Spanish and Europeans in Florida. By the time he landed, things were starting to unravel in the cultures and societies of the natives that were living on the Florida Peninsula, because of the Spanish had been there just long enough to do some damage. We'll just talk about that in that way. But one of his first notes is, when we arrived on the shoreline, the natives were about setting the land with fire. What he didn't know, and we were able to find out later, that was a way of welcoming people. Here we are. So they were burning that palmetto strand, and we know on those barrier islands, there's always some kind of palmetto strand to say, hey, we're here. If you're interested in history, particularly about this part of Florida, because the journey that Jonathan Dickinson had his wife and baby with him, and they survived the trip all the way to St. Augustine, walking up the coast. And we don't know what happened, but the Florida natives hated the British already. And these guys, Jonathan Dickinson and his crew, were British. And the natives figured it out, and they didn't do them any favors. We don't know why they were so biased towards the British, because the Spanish hadn't been helpful either. Well, there's some things that we'll never know. And so there's this great lithograph that was produced about that particular moment. And there's often hear comments, well, we don't know much about indigenous fire use in Florida. And this is a image of a ceremony, a fire-related ceremony of the indigenous people of South Florida. You may know them, Seminoles and the Miccosukees. And if you look at this quote from Stephen Pine, who is a well-known fire historian. I used another one of his quotes earlier. One of the things about lightning is it's not particularly efficient. We've already made that case, but it can happen when fuels, wind, those kind of things align. You can get decent sized fire from lightning. But if you want the objectives, for whatever reason humans might have, and I think you could probably check down the list, is that you're going to have to put fire yourself. And I want you to imagine, for a little thought experiment, that first moment when humans, we know right now that the human use of fire goes back at least 30 million years, and now they're picking up on some evidence of Neanderthals knew how to use fire, which is precursor Homo population to us. So you can chalk up a whole lot of fire with a small amount of people. I think I'm in a room full of a small amount of people who has put a lot of fire on the ground. Lightning has to have, or natural, so-called natural ignitions, and we'll pull this apart pretty soon. It has to have all those things we've talked about, receptive fuels, and for it to get us in our 1 to 3 year fire return interval, it's going to have to live overnight, because it's probably going to, lightning strike's going to have in the afternoon. It's going to have to live overnight. Anybody know the concept of moisture of extinction? Does it ever get a little moist and dewy at night in Florida? There are a few days a year where that doesn't happen, where you get, humidity recovery that's not 100%. So that lightning strike would have had to happen in an afternoon. Then day after day, it would have had good conditions. And we saw in 98, you can get those days, but they're rare. If you're going to have well-burnt ecosystems, it's very likely that there's going to be some human additives to it. So who did that, why, and when? And of course, and somewhere around the 18th century, my people showed up. The so-called Florida crackers. And this is from an urban geographer that came down on the train down the East Coast of Florida to Miami when they were starting to plan out Miami for development in the 1930s. As one passes through the train, it seems as if the entire state was burning for the 590 laws. It is incredible to the observer how any vegetation can remain. Now, we're looking at someone, and what's happened is Millicent Todd Bingham is from New York. She's never seen anything like this. And we might have that going on in our neighborhoods too. They're from ecosystems that don't burn as frequently. They are part of the policy of the Florida cracker, who is greedy to make its state attractive to winter visitors. And yet thinks the way to do that is to denude it of all plant growth. Now we know better. But here we see early on some of the thinking that from the outsiders can have about the way we manage the land in Florida. And of course, one of our more famous conservationists, she had her own opinions. If any of you had to endure the book River of Grass when they were in high school, it's actually quite a beautiful book and elegant prose. But as much as Marjorie Stoneman Douglas has helped us protect a place like the Everglades, she only set foot into it 3 times. So again, we have an urban person looking at practices that they didn't quite understand, even as well educated as Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was. Her legacy is more than just an unfortunate school in Southeast Florida. It's a powerful contribution to conservation history. It was one of our first huge protected areas in this state. And also on the state park side, does anybody know of Jim Stevenson? Here's a claim that he was making, Myakka Prairie. And the self-appointed lightning season burning evangelist. He was also, maybe you know the state park history a little better than I do, but he was also did what I understand was one of the first prescribed burns in Florida State Park history at Falling Waters. He'd been to Tall Timbers, talked to Comeric and others and said, we need to try this. What might be interesting in some of you is Comeric's wife was the burn boss of that first burn in Falling Waters State Park. There's a little bit of problem with doing identifying fire history in Florida, particularly this is one from Huffman's paper back in 2006. And this particular site was from St. Joseph Bay, which is up in the Panhandle, but also she did some work deep into the Florida Peninsula. And most of her work, it goes back fairly deep. But one of the things that, unlike tree rings we can do in the West, one of the things that we see is that you can only go back so far in Florida history. Also, the wood, the tree rings in Florida are unreliable. And also, it only records the most intense fires. And so we see this old Comeric data from 62, 63, which she used. And also we see some of her data here, A, B, C, and D, showing the fire scars. Most of the fires she recording were in May, because we can tell reasonably good what month. The other questionable thing about this is that the inference that because it was in May, it must be a lightning fire. What I did was I went and looked at all the plat maps and all the land ownership maps and the history of some of these sites. What was going on in 1800s in Florida? The pioneer era, lots of land clearing and burning. Most certainly my ancestors, I know they were burning in May. Family war. Also, until the Civil War, we had been through 3 seminal wars, the most expensive and most protracted indigenous wars in this country. And with warfare comes fire. So many of her signals were picked up. Maybe they were lightning, but maybe they were one of these other explanations. So to load too much on this data, and that's not to say lightning doesn't exist, it doesn't cause scars, and it doesn't happen in May, but we need to smooth that out a little bit. Here's some that was mentioned before, and this is just an example about positive, and this is the old BLM style from the mid-2000s. And May 1st to June 16th, the traditional lightning season in the river grass. And you can see you don't have to be a fire behavior analyst to know that when you've got about 1 million acres of grass, and we don't use KBDI down there because we really don't have soil. KBDI requires us to have 8 inches of well-developed soil. If you're on a sandhill, you don't have 8 inches of soil. And if you're in Everglades, but you can imagine a point source ignition, one of these powerful bolts hitting the Everglades with a good wind, dry May conditions, when your water levels who are already altered by Everglades drainage, you've got flammable fuels, right? With these 16,369 downstrikes happening in this period, how many fires do you think we got out of this? 0. Maybe it was an anomalous year. But actually, in my experience in looking at the records in the Everglades, most of our large fire acres from lightning season and lightning fires were added to with the helicopter and the ping pong balls, because we used them as opportunities to get some acres burned. We didn't have to use our prescribed fire funding. Frequent fire is important. And a lot of us are burning for biodiversity reasons, or productivity, or wildlife reasons. And we have to ask this question, and it goes to the theme that I've been speaking of here. Here's what we know now from especially Dr. Kay's work here. Aboriginal lightning rates were up to 13,000 times greater than known ignition rates. If you're in the Zurich West and the RH is 5 and the wind speed's 25, and you're on a slope that hasn't been burned in 60 years. But if you're on a landscape like Florida, you're narrow, your windows are fairly narrow. I'm not saying it's not ecologically and important, and it's not important for management risk and all those other things, but I'm trying to build a case that humans are pretty good at spreading fire around the planet. And one of the things that I want you to think about is animal mortality. We've grabbed upon things like strip ignition. And if you ever wondered how we got to where we are in some of our ignition techniques, we got it from the foresters who didn't want to kill overstory trees. So what they started doing is developing techniques. And if you've seen this old thing called A Guide to Prescribed Fire in Southern Forest, it's the first reference I was able to see where they laid out all the ignition techniques, spots, chevrons, that kind of thing. But when you're putting fire to a piece of land, I want you to realize that that's someone's home. I want you to be artistic, if you will, and sensitive with your drip torches. You can do this well. You just keep it in a box and getting the acres black. There's far more to this. One of the things that this particular study that was fairly extensive is the takeaway here is only fire severity affected animal mortality. And with a higher proportion of animals being killed by high rather than low intensity fire. This is why I would ask you to maybe not put so much emphasis on seasonality, but your objectives and what you want to do and what you don't want to do during any prescription that you develop. In the real world, though, you know this because you're out there with it and you have to deal with all kinds of variables out there. There are a few easy answers. This particular study, and it was fascinating with one of my colleagues that I teach with, they looked at fires across the Southeast coastal plain, and they were really curious about this question of lightning fire effects. And fire effects is really where I spend most of my time at. And one of the things that they found, and it was a little bit to my surprise, that deer fawns survive better, have better survivability, at least initially, the closer they are to what y'all would call, which is this idea is starting to dissolve, growing season fires, because you can't tell me when your growing season starts, and you can't tell me which species you're talking about either. But one of the things that they found is the ones that happen during that period, growing season, the fawns had a higher rate of survivability. So that shows, amongst a whole handful of evidence, the benefits of lightning or growing season fires, or fires during that particular season. Here's the downside of it. They also found out that coyotes figured this out really quick. And the mortality, the survivability was overtopped by the mortality from coyote. That's why I say there are a few easy answers in this. And I would want to advocate for, as I always do, for fire monitoring. Here's one much closer to home by one of our amazing scientists. If you're not aware of Archibald Biological Station, and I hope you are, they mostly manage scrub and they do an enormous amount of research in the Florida scrub. And this is a paper by Eric Mangus and his colleagues, about fire temperatures and residency time. And here's one of the takeaways. A range of fire regimes can be used in prescribed fire management without having major impacts on resprouting plants in Florida scrub and related vegetation. We're often told, and it's part of the phone game we often play, that growing season fires doing one thing and then dormant season fires do another. And as I start to wrap up here, this is an important paper. Who here prescribes a fire return interval to their landscape? I'm getting a few gator arms, but there's some big ones up there. In this paper, you'll see that the assumptions It is impossible to infer historic fire regimes accurately. Fire suppressed communities are ecological, and also the assumption is that fire suppressed communities are degraded. Well, that depends on the species that you're targeting. Reinstating fire regimes is the best course of action based on a global shift towards novel abiotic and biotic conditions. So this particular paper examined the underpinning of these assumptions, and here's what they found. Is that the practice of inferring these historic fire regimes for entire regions or ecosystems often entails substantial uncertainty. We can do better than a guessing game, folks. It is therefore unlikely that all three assumptions will be fully held for any landscape which is prescribed fire is being applied. To best achieve conservation goals, researchers should seek to understand contemporary fire biota reactions across tropic level, functional groups, spatial and temperature and management contexts. And what that really means is that we have to take a very close look at our actions there. And the way to do that is through fire effects monitoring. A lot of you have to do restoration or a senior management plan, this concept of restoring. I want to tell you that I want to ask you, which Florida are you restoring? Because that black and white image here is what Florida looked like a long time ago. In other words, and you see the coastline, how it's shifted up and down. Which Florida are you restoring? What are the metrics? And can you actually really go back in time? And also to acknowledge, because by the way, it is Native American Heritage Month. Some of the archaeologists, especially some of the ones that we're working with, now believe that just from Central Florida south, there are around 80,000 people living here at first Spanish contact, and they call that a conservative estimate. The rich cultures that exist here are no longer part of this landscape. And we have this, what I call the pristine myth, that somehow that there was this world where humans weren't effing up things, and they weren't even here, and that things were Adam and Eve country. And what this paper describes is pristine landscapes simply do not exist, and in most cases have not existed for millennia. That doesn't mean that there's not pockets on the earth that are underpopulated, but when I'm working in Brazil and we're flying fires, we find people looking at us in a helicopter, and I'm pretty sure they haven't seen that before. And the link between present-day patterns of biodiversity and historic processes, I think, are really important. There's this great book by Emma Maris, and one of the takeaways from Rambunctious Garden is although some conservationists' reverence for particular historic ecosystems can approach the religious, and maybe you've had some dogmatic people in your discussions about when to burn and how to burn and all of that. And one of the things I want to leave you here with, particularly an important, one of the most imperiled birds in North America, is the Florida grasshopper sparrow. And this is an extremely important paper because now we're reintroducing, I think they just reintroduced their 1,000th of captive bred sparrow back into the landscape. Here's what they found. We found burning at dry prairie during the transition, April and June sequence, subsequently a reduced reproductive output by delaying nest construction. And the bobwhite quail thinking that goes into this is that if we burn up a nest, they'll just re-nest, right? But one of the things we see in the multiple re-nesting is the survival rate goes down. The most survival rates are in the first clutch. It was disturbing to hear the other day that the working group working with this particular bird, there was a suggestion, it's like, when can we go back to lightning season burning? And I think this paper shows that it might be something you want to avoid. So what I worry about with this, the effort to reintroduce the Florida grasshopper species, they're putting these captive birds back in the same management regimes because they burn when they're on the nest. And these birds are hard to detect. There might be other options. This is an important paper. I don't know why science doesn't always make it in. And these are some of our folks from Australia who are still doing it the way they've done it for a long time. And of course, in modern North America, we're probably not going to be doing this. We're probably not going to be taking our children, our rifle, and our drip torch and setting the woods on fire. But here's something I want you to consider, because Homo sapiens, humans, have been vilified quite a bit. And Aldo Leopold, if you remember this conservationist, he said to save all the pieces. And I will tell you, one of those pieces is Homo sapiens. And y'all have extended the work of Homo sapiens through your work on the ground. And just a few final comments here. We're facing some knotty problems in Florida. Anybody know this pretty little fern? You spray it, right? I heard aerial spraying, early question today. This is a knotty problem. How are we going to get rid of something that is wind-borne? And we put a petri dish almost any part of Florida, we can collect Lygodium spores anywhere, downtown Miami. On the other hand, we have another exotic, and the Florida Cattlemen's Association will tell us they've got 4 million acres of this planted in Florida. What is it? Are we on a war against Bahia grass? Oh, hell no. You can be part of the wildlife corridor now and get a conservation easement for having 10,000 acres of Bahia grass. Did I say that out loud? And of course, exotic animals. I don't know who's going to win between the alligator and the Burmese python, but we have new Americans here. And they're from places, tropical environments, subtropical environments, just like and one of the things that for all of us is that if you have to do endangered species and compliance like I did for the federal government for so long, because we have to describe in site-specific details the impact. And I know we have a federal folks too, but the way the Endangered Species Act, and we have to get a biologic opinion, a biologic assessment, or EIS, we have to describe that. And we're dealing with many trophic levels in Florida, from the Florida panther all the way to the leafwing, Florida leafwing, which, by the way, I believe is listed now in the Bartram's hairstreak, which lives in the ground cover in the pine rocklands in the Everglades, where fire operates. In the UN, the use of fire is our culture. I was taught to burn by my ancestors. This is my 87-year-old mom lighting up her woods. David was with us when we did this particular burn. We've been burning here for generations. Many of the pieces of land that y'all are on were not only burnt by natives, but the pioneers that came before you, the people who own this land. And I wish you well as you go into this knotty and complex journey that you're on. Because again, I'm proud of you, doing amazing work. And I'll leave you this. I also, when I'm not here doing firework, I'm working with Into Nature Films. And we are just wrapping up Little Brown Bird, which is a film about the Florida grasshopper sparrow. And it will probably unpack a lot of these ideas that I've shared with you today. And also there's some pretty cool fire films on intonature.org too. I'll leave you that. I've almost got about 10 minutes out, 5-10 minutes over. Thank you for going on this wild little ride with me, and I appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you.